as a 7-year-old boy, only child with a sick mother, that experience is sort of probably in the archives of what we would call unconscious trauma. I think there's certain events that we all go through as kids that they don't have to be as drastic as a child losing a parent. But, kids go through a lot of shit, let's face it, and sometimes stuff that really is abhorrent and shouldn't be condoned. But so for me, the immediate answer with my mom is I don't quite know how that impacted me. I've done a lot of reverse engineering, and especially, the last decade plus of like, okay, what is that? Without sounding too Jungian, the mother wound that, might have left me as a young boy and a man. How do I relate to the feminine? And all of that's quite interesting. I think years gone by in older relationships, where it manifested as I was perhaps overly accommodating as a boyfriend, as a partner, because that was the pattern that I'd learned, right? That my needs don't matter as a kid. In fact, not only do they not matter, there's no one that can tend to them, because the attention was, of course, on my mum, who was dying. So I think I became the quintessential good boy who was well behaved, never had tantrums, was quiet, shy, but tended to his own needs. And so I think, that has played out in various relationships where I was overly accommodating, overly thoughtful, didn't necessarily speak my truth for fear of rocking the boat or upsetting somebody who is not well, So that was pivotal. And I think I've worked through so much of that and understanding the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, which is obviously a pain point for, I think, most people in their lives, but I think also an exquisite way that we experience love. And then with my dad, it was obviously a little bit more, it's more apparent the impact it had because I was older. So, I had a bit more wherewithal and experience as a 17-year-old, albeit, as you said, 1 year away from being officially an adult. But we know that people in their 40s are still not adults.
That's right. Yeah, that's
that I help, who are being driven by their subconscious child patterns. But that was as an experience subjectively much harder, just because my mum had already gone, and so the relationship that got forged between my father and I was at one level exquisite, right? Because there was just this beautiful human that was my father, who was so loving, so kind, and in ways that I couldn't comprehend, that I've subsequently looked back on. What was his experience? Not only of, now being the sole custodian of his pride and joy, his son, but also what was his heart going through? The fact that his own wife died, and as a kid, you don't think about those things, it's all, most human beings throughout the course of their life, I call it WIFM radio, which is what's in it for me, sort of, that's why most people are tuned, how does this affect me and what do I get from this? And, it's all self-referral. So even as a kid, I wasn't thinking, oh, wow, I knew my dad was obviously impacted and sad, but, now I wish I could go back as an adult and man to man and just talk to him about what was that like, and who helped you through that? Or how did you come to, find profound acceptance with sometimes the severity of life? And so that one hurt me a lot more just by virtue of the fact it was us. I did have a woman come into my life when I was around 12 who was sort of like a stepmother. She never married my father, but she moved in, and so it became like what's called a common law wife.
Okay.
And she was a lovely lady, although not my mum. And, we got along, and I, as a good kid, played the good role and called her mum for a while and whatever. But,
and was she living with you when your dad passed? Was she still living with you?
Yeah, she was still there. She actually still lives in the house that I was brought up in with my dad. Okay. I'm going to go and visit in September. Because I'm speaking at an event in London. And so I'm going to go down there, and I haven't been to that house for a long time. So it's going to be interesting to see how that feels. But so it was definitely pivotal. But at the same time, even though for years, friends, loved ones, sort of pseudo family would send me notes every year on the anniversary of my dad's passing, just because it was so tragic, and it was, all across the world and certainly nationally in the UK, because close to a couple hundred people died. Wow. So it was sort of, it was a real, certainly a horrific experience for people to witness. It was all over the news for days as bodies were being pulled out of the water. So friends would be like, oh gosh, so sorry for your loss. And I lived in that narrative for a long time, that I lost my parents. But that became sort of reconciled when I was in my first loving relationship that I thought was, sort of potentially a partner for life. And she left me, and there was, without going into the details, but that was when I sort of had my epiphany and my sort of Sartori moment of awakening, where I realized I was still in the story of loss. And as a boyfriend with her, I was being driven by the fear of loss, right? So I became the perfect boyfriend as a coping strategy, as an adaptation to
so you
avoid
wouldn't lose someone important to you again. And how old were you when you were dating her?
29.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so it was a sort of a decade plus later, and it was that sort of Saturn return for those people who are into astrology, where we go through the grinder of some sort of transformative event, usually between 29 and 31. So that's sort of an overarching view of the loss that wasn't a loss, but was still really painful, and I still miss them. But at the same time, it informed who I am today in ways that I couldn't have, possibly comprehended back then. But I think to your point, when you kind of said earlier how much I care, how much I see so much suffering, and how much compassion I have for that, I think is in large part because, I went through it myself. So I don't recommend it. I wouldn't, I don't wish it upon anyone, but nonetheless, we all have our crosses to bear, and apparently that's mine. And at one level, I guess I'm grateful that even though it was only 17 years with my dad and 7 with my mom, that I had 2 of the most loving parents any child could ever wish for. And so it was a lot of quality, maybe not so much quantity of years, but I would always pick that over 70 years, but maybe not so much love and affection.